Welcome to UberCube, the place where we talk about Cube with refreshments. I'm your host, Magic, and I am joined by my other host,
Anthony. Hello, everyone.
And today we have an interesting conversation where we're going to just talk about the metagames of your environment and how to address it, and what we do personally as curators to deal with whatever we consider our best deck of the environment. So, I guess I'll start it off with the question of, do you have a meta deck in your specific environment that you want to talk about, and why it's the best, and whether or not you consider it a problem?
Well, I'm going to let the people ponder on that for just a second. Before we go any further down this rabbit hole, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube. We're going to enjoy our refreshments of the show. May, what are you having today?
I am having a quirk that is blackberry sage flavored.
I am having Carolina Brewing Company, but I am having their chocolate cherry stout. All right, May, you want to get to the topic. Here we go. Back to the question. You were asking...
Back to the actual question.
How do I, as a curator, manage my best deck in my environment?
Yeah.
So, difficult question, because I have lots of environments. 100% a moving scale for me. So I'll start out with a couple of the most known environments I have. The first one would be UberBear's Horror Cube, that's going to be featured at CubeCon 2023.
Be there. Be square. I hope to see you there.
Everybody, we want to see you all there. But so the best deck, what would be the best deck in that? So that has been a highly evolving environment. When I first started building that cube, it came out and it was, oh man, I just got to do the monster mash. I've got to do faction upon faction versus faction, because my first vision for that environment would be werewolves, vampires, zombies, spirits, humans. So
a lot
and
of
so
those
forth.
subtypes matters.
But the problem was that they just didn't do anything dynamic. It's it was 2/1s attacking a 2/1, you block, battle exchange, moving on, and it got pretty dry, pretty uninteresting, pretty quickly. It completely lacked any dynamic type of lines of play. So as I was curating that environment, I overstepped. So sometimes you do that. So I was trying to weigh the scales on balance. It went from super boring, flat, where creatures were just lining up on the battlefield and actually not over. It was basically king of the hill. Whereas in my new environment, I tried to add layers and depth. And I overcorrected is the word I'm looking for. The best deck emerged pretty quickly because I was trying to run stuff like Grizzlebrand, because it was from the Innistrad plane. In order to compensate that, I later was convinced or led myself to believe, well, if you're going to have demons, you got to have angels. So I started putting in the Avacins and all these different creatures that kind of countermeasures against the best card versus the best card. It was he who has, or the person who has the biggest stick will win the battle. But it actually really lost the entire focus of what I was attempting to do in that environment. I wanted to do the monster mash at its core. When I started adding these other elements of a higher power, higher tier, because I wanted to replicate my 540 vintage cube. Do you see where I was kind of muddling the mixture?
Yeah.
Unbalancing it, overcorrecting? May, do you have any thoughts on that one?
So, it is really easy for us as curators to kind of overcorrect a problem, and when we kind of overcorrect it, sometimes we can overstep and make an accidental best deck because of it. And I've definitely had that problem in the Fake Cube in previous iterations, and sometimes when we see an issue and we're wanting to encourage a certain type of thing, then we just kind of start slamming a bunch of things until something sticks. I had that issue with 2 different decks in my Fake Cube, where I had the Mill deck and I had the Wolves that were both particularly spicy in the metagame at different points.
So one of the things to kind of talk about, like this idea that we're discussing, it's when we were kind of pre-gaming, May and I are talking about, like, because we're doing this like super meta. We don't have any show notes. I'm going to have to develop those after the fact. Whatever we talk about, we talk about. But one of the most interesting things that I found happens in this type of idea is it's like digging in the sand. So every time you displace or dethrone your best deck, the next batter, if you will, comes up to bat. So your second place becomes suddenly your first place. It's a perpetual, never-ending cycle of every time you try to trim the hedges, the proverbial hedges, something else, another root will grow up, another weed will come forward.
It's your Hydra's heads.
You can't predict it. It's your Hydra's heads, right?
It's your refilling hole. It's The classic
Yes.
conundrum.
So how do you balance that as a curator? I think's the point, or what she wanted to talk about during this episode. How do we not overtip the scales or overcorrect? So back in my case of my horror cube, where I wanted it to emulate my powered vintage cube, that I thought that I had to put cube staples in there to bring it to life, to make it recognized to my players who've been playing my powered vintage cube, that they would find it interesting. I overcorrected, right? And that's not to dismiss like the typical cube staples. Like I still run the preordains, and I'll run the brainstorms, and I'll run stuff like, we'll say, Phyrexian Arena at the time, something that these are pretty benign staples. But then I got into, as I mentioned before, the Griselbrands and the Avacens, and I started really power creeping. And that's what we talked about, Stu and I talked about during our last meta conversation, is that I overcorrected. I turned the ship too fast, right? I see the iceberg. I realize that I've went off keel, and I try to change my trajectory in the environment, but I overcorrect. And so I cut cards. But when I do that, the next batter steps up, right? In this case, it would be like my Spells Matters, a very generic, very known to the community archetype, suddenly becomes more prevalent when I remove the reanimator threats or those big high payoffs for that package. Suddenly another package steps up and becomes my next. So I overcorrect. This is an overcorrection thing. I think that's what we're talking about during this episode. Would you agree, May?
Yeah, I agree. I finally got my train of thought back now that my two brain cells decided to just connect and have a big think. So what I was going to say is that in the specific instance of your horror cube, going from that kind of, I almost want to say, war environment, where it's whoever is just drafting the best cards and hitting the most damage every turn, then what becomes your best deck becomes extremely boring, because whatever your best cards are just going to be what's drafted. And when you start adding those complexity layers to it over time, then it makes your metagame more interesting, rather than just the individual cards that make those decks good. And when you're talking about when you're power creeping your environment, unsurprisingly, this concept goes hand in hand with power creep and how your meta evolves and changes. Because the more that you introduce that kind of higher power flavor into your horror cube, the more that it starts to tip the boat. The more the orca's coming up and biting the propeller off your ship, right? Because the more that you're trying to push that power level, it's super easy to overcorrect a deck that you just wanted people to play I want people to play demons, I want people to play angels. Here are just some of the best demons and angels. Well, you got what you wanted, the monkey's paw curled. But now what do you do to fix that except just reverse it? Because the whole reason that you made that change was to fix it. So
an example of that, so I had this presented to me today in our Discord. And you have to pardon me, I'm going to totally mispronounce this Discord tag here, but I think it's Dionychus. Anyways, Deinonychus.
Forgive us for trying our best.
Yes, forgive us for I'm trying. But a shout out to the question that I received from this individual that's in our Discord. And it was at Anthony. How good are signets and talismans deck in your horror cube? So I'm thinking they're saying 5-color good stuff in so many words, right? And I haven't played it, but I'm looking at your list, and it seems like drafting as many of them as possible with very powerful control spells like Mystic Confluence and Toxic Deluge would be really hard to beat. The answer is yes. But then I responded, talismans are great. But 5-color good stuff is not something that's generally been a problem, because the environment draws people to the factions. Like, you can choose to be 5-color good stuff in that environment. Yes. Could you win with it? Yes. But something about the allure of the environment, very much like the Fey Cube, is you want to play the vampire faction. You want to, it's kind of a story role that pulls you in. It's a book, right? And it pulls you in. So for me as a drafter, sure, I'll do vampires and werewolves combo, right? And I'll make some kind of weird, amalgamation of those two. But I'll stay along those lines, or maybe the monster mash. But what I don't do is try to draft good stuff in that environment. Unlike my 540 powered vintage cube, it screams you can do trilands or, triomes and get 5-color good stuff out the bat. This one here really beckons you to want to live in that environment. So to answer the question of Dionychus, I think I pronounced that right, is yes, you could do 5-color good stuff. Could you win? Yes. You could build a control deck or an Esper control deck, and you could totally rumple stomp with it. It has been done. But something about that allure of playing spirits just really pulls people in. And I've had a lot of players comment on that. They want to do a thing, but they get pulled into the story elements. I would say the same holds true with the Fey Cube.
Mm-hmm.
If I wanted to do 5-color good stuff in your environment, I could.
Mm-hmm. The environment's definitely slow enough. You could definitely pull it off.
I could. But something about, like, I really want to run Grum Gully with some goblins pulls me in as a drafter because it's more about the experience than it is the winning for me. I'm not walking away from the Fey Cube saying I want to be the champion. I want to experience the storytelling of that environment. And I don't want to make it homogenous or wash it out by choosing just to go across all the elements of your environment and say I drafted pile.deck and I won. Yeah, maybe I could. I probably could. But I think part of what you and I do, May, is we tell a story. And no one wants to, it's kind of like, do you want to read that compelling story from the New York Times about the latest grandeur that's happened in such and such? Or do you want to read just some, you know what I mean? I don't want my story elements to be flat. So I think it depends about the drafters. If you're there as a grinder, sure, go after the 5-color good stuff in all of our cube environments. But if you're there for the experience.
So I'm actually going to pull you down to the next level of this conversation. And I hope that you're ready for this, because we're going on a trip.
You do this to me all the time.
I do it to you all the time.
You guys really want to test me.
Yes, constantly have to keep you on your feet. That's just what I do. But for the second layer of this is when something is identified as the best deck for your environment, is that a problematic factor because it's the best deck? Or is it going to be the best deck only if nobody eats their vegetables? So, in my Fey Cube, since we're talking about it, there is a best deck that the data does not support. The data does not show this as, like, being a very consistent deck. It does not show up very often, and there's a good reason why. Changelings. The Changeling 5-color good stuff pile is probably the best deck in the cube. Period. If you can just grab all the Changelings, all the subtype payoffs, and whatever you can grab, then you're going to have probably the best deck in the environment, and you're going to run away with the game. But here's the catch. It never shows up in data, because even though it's the best deck, everybody's on the same page of knowing that these cards are the most relevant for whatever deck that I'm building, so everybody's drafting those cards. That deck's only going to come together if people aren't eating their vegetables. Same thing with all the Signet.pile deck, is that these decks happen when people aren't eating their vegetables, they aren't getting their fixing, they aren't getting their good lands, they aren't getting their changelings for Fey Cube to answer and grab every single payoff, because there's only so many cards that you can draft. And when you are picking whatever you consider to be the best pick of that pack, trying to get every changeling is just not going to happen, because you have up to 8 other people also trying to grab the changelings, regardless of if they're going for the changeling deck. So that deck never happens. Statistics don't show it, even though it's the best deck at the cube.
I would say it kind of suffers from that. We talked about this before, that preordained nature that blue is the best color of Magic, right? So when a cube comes out, drafters, if they want to go and they say blue's the best, I'm going to draft blue.
Yep.
So but they don't realize blue's being spread across the spectrum because everyone has that same notion.
Yep.
Well, if I go into your cube environment and you've announced changelings are amazing, and they are, in fact, I can attest to this, changelings are changeling glue in your environment. So if I want to run a lord that's a night lord and I pick up some changelings, then I can have a deck that actually functions. But I think back to the changelings in your environment, I use them more as spackle, less as glue. Like, I still try to follow the schemes and the themes that you want to represent within that environment. And I'll splash a few changelings, but I don't do generic changelings and then try to throw in some lords just to get some, I don't know, some anthems or buffs or some kind of premier outcome here.
Right.
I think the story elements of your cube and the nature of the type of drafter that I am doesn't really tell. I'm not a grinder. I'm not here to win. I'm here to experience what you as the curator are trying to tell me, or at least I'm trying to, right? So for me, it's part of the experience. So I'm there to enjoy the game. So like when I said before, Grum Gully would be my lord, quote unquote, right? And sure, I'll get some really great goblins out of your environment. But I could splash a changeling, but I'm not going to try to do Grum Gully plus some kind of changelings.
Because changeling just has anti-synergy with Grum Gully by intention.
It does, right? Because, yeah, it does.
I have very specifically added a bunch of non-human things that care about that. because...
And then you have the unicorn, too. Are you running that unicorn, the green-white one that does that, too? The +1/+1 counters? The Good Fortune unicorn in your environment?
No, I'm not
Good
running
Fortune
Good Fortune unicorn.
You should! Oh my gosh! A unicorn in a...
The problem is that my Selesnya slots are Trelessera and...
and then you can throw in the Persist combo, and there you go.
Tulsimer Friend to Wolves. That's what it was.
Yeah, I'll take a peek after that, but I think Good Fortune Unicorn deserves a place with the 1/1 counter synergies. I love it.
I don't hate that idea.
Yeah, I would draft, and it fits your environment, hits your theme. Down the price point size are there too, because there you go.
I don't hate that idea, and I'm a little sad that I think I didn't cut it. I think I kept it. Yeah, Daybreak Charger is still in here. I try to have one unicorn in here, and because the loneliest unicorn, I have to have the one unicorn. But finding the plus spot for that unicorn that's the least obtrusive, people aren't happy because of additive distraction of Daybreak Charger. They see it and they're like, well, it's not a subtype that I care about, even though it's just a 3/1 that comes in and makes something indestructible.
All right, so back to your core question it was about, like, what do you do as a curator to deal with your best deck? And that's an interesting one. And as we talked about, every time you cut one, another one replaces it. Right. I mean, that's kind of the generic answer to that. I have one interesting for you that I experienced today. So as you know, we built our dumpster fire where we have episodes recorded on that. And what we've done is we did this collaboration between both curators and non-curators, and everybody submitted X amount of cards that were, the criteria was it must be rare or mythic, must be under $2. Everybody just send in your notes and I'll compile it into Cube Cobra as the administrator. I'm going to curate it out, build it, and then me and my good friend Chris Moore, aka Sandwich, will do kind of the final cuts. And then everybody bring your cards in. We're going to sleeve them up. Dumpster fire cube. Ta-da. Ta-da. Well, as you imagine, and every cube curator deals with this, you build this really great thing. And it's hard enough to get people to show up to play your cube to begin with. But imagine not only getting them to show up, but they are also the curators to getting them to show up. So we had people for the very first time, and I can't even remember when I recorded those episodes, and we're going to record more because we have more to offer on this subject, is we had our good friend Jason Brinkley, Dr. Jason Brinkley. He actually played it last night for the first time, and he kind of said, felt clunky. And then our good friend, aka Sandwich, said, I'm not really a big fan of that environment. And then if you ask me, I'm a huge fan of that environment because I've won 9 times out of 10. So I don't know I'm not quite sure where that's coming from, but I have tested every single
I'm winning, so clearly it's the best environment.
So clearly it's a really great environment, right? But I do see their points. Is because we had stuff in there that was so bad. We had like the mono red Wumpus, the name eludes me. I can look it up, but we cut some really bad cards. And it's because they were added by people who had never curated before, and they really got captured by that allure of,
Shivan Wumpus.
What do you mean? Yeah, Shivan Wumpus. Could you read that card just for the audience? Read it, just for the idea.
Sure. Shivan Wumpus is a
so bad
3 and a red for a 6/6 beast with trample. When it comes into play, any player may sacrifice a land. If a player does, put it on top of the owner's library.
Exactly.
Jeez.
So this was contributed by our good friend Avram, who will be recording us soon. And he's currently working on his first, actually official cube. My point is that this was an interesting experiment, a thought experiment of like, what if you just get people hyped up about building cubes? They've never done it before. What if we gave them like the proverbial swimmies for going swimming in the swimming pool, and myself and Stu and other people who've kind of, done this before, have some knowledge about it, could help them through the idea of it. But we also didn't want to put them on rails. Just give me what you got. Well, feedback has come in as of last night. We don't like it very much. Not me, because I didn't get the draft, but the others are like, And even Chris is like, I have an idea. And he sent me a little gif of actually throwing a cube into a fire. So a little irony there, right? So my point is today I spent the morning like, all right, I don't think we should throw this away. We're going to salvage this. So I actually put together a list of cards to add a level of depth. And I emulated what May has suggested. I'm trying to do the red dump land. Is that what you call it?
Land up red.
Yep.
You were close, just wrong order.
Yep. Same difference. We're going to dump them. But Countryside Crusher was an idea. Like, how can I salvage? They're saying they don't like it. That's not a good start for a curator, right?
Right.
And They're saying that this environment didn't bring them joy. It felt clunky. Not a good start for a curator. But I'm not going to give up. Same as I didn't give up on my horror cube when I built it, when it was just, werewolf slamming into vampire do nothing out of complete and utter boredom. A lot of time, the time value of money has come into effect here. I'm invested now, right? And I'm going to make this great. So I'm not promising it's going to be great, but I did approximately 35, 40 cuts today. And now that does kind of break the idea of this dumpster fire cube, but I mostly replaced my cards, believe it or not. That was my hard part today, actually, this morning, is I don't want to cut their really bad cards. I'm going to cut my really bad cards because I don't want any hard feelings. But I did ask permission. But my point is not only are you dealing with the top level as a curator and always cutting it, trying to flatten that power level out so you don't overcorrect, the bottom's also having problems too. And the dumpster fire just so happens to reach the bottom faster than others. May, do you have any thoughts on that idea?
So, when it comes to your dumpster fire cube, which is so appropriately named, just putting that out there.
Or for Anthony Mangold, to quote, I have said the word dumper fire multiple times.
So with that environment, because it's such a literal dumpster fire of an environment, there are a lot of elements that kind of keep it from being cohesive and makes it, like it was mentioned, clunky and whatever. So when you're trying to figure out what that best deck is, it creates a high contrast between all of your bad cards, your Shiv and Wumpus and whatnot, and then your
Dust Elemental.
Oh my god, Elemental.
This card's so bad. Dust Elemental. Let me explain this. Like talking about dust in the wind. Let me look this card up. Oh my gosh. So Dust Elemental. Just to put this in the idea, this was also, I believe, Avram, our good friend. Dust Elemental for 2 colorless and 2 planes. You get a creature elemental. Flash, not so bad, right? It's a 6/6, also not so bad. Flying, fear. Ooh, fear, not so bad. When Dust Elemental comes into play, return 3 creatures you control to their owner's hand. It was bad. So good, and then became so bad. And so it was funny, and people are like, "Nope, not drafting it." Passed. Actually, whenever I told the gang today that I was going to go through and start making some additions that still met the price criteria and stuff like that, I was like, "This is going to be super easy to cut." And then I started looking. I'm like, "No, it's really not that easy to cut." Like, I'm exchanging a Dust Elemental for something that's like a little bit better than a Dust Elemental. Yeah. Curating has its highs and lows in terms of what May was saying. When we're trying to cut from the top, you're always going to have the next thing that's going to resurface. But imagine if you're in the dumpster fire lane and you're cutting from the bottom and then something else replaces the bottom. It's so interesting, right?
Right. But when it comes to readdressing your approach of, I like what the top is doing, I'm not trying to cut the top just for the next thing to replace the top. Now I'm trying to correct the bottom by cutting out the bottom and trying to bring those other ducks up.
It's a whole different way of thinking. It's not trying to take down the most powerful. It's trying to take down the most awful or egregious, right? I'm trying to cut out the bad cards that people don't want to draft. We'll call it draft chaff. My good friend Christian actually summed it up today in the dumpster fire. He's like, I love it. I actually like this environment. It feels a lot like a chaos draft to me. And I go, oh, man, that's why we don't like it. It doesn't. And Chris said it best. He's like, oh, yeah, it's because it doesn't have any defined archetypes. I'm like, all right, I see the problem. So part of my fix today, or what I spent my day today to do this correction that we're talking about, the May and I don't know if it's going to work. I just went through my collection. I found the cards that met the criteria. Had to be rare, mythic, under $2. And I said, well, I can see some shortcomings. So green in the iteration that we had before of the dumpster fire cube was pretty generic, or it required a lot of pips, but it was also just big stompy nonsense. If you drafted green, good chance you're going to win because you were just getting stuff like Terastodon as your top end, and you had so much time to do it, it wasn't really that big of a deal. So I said, well, I'm going to make something more mid-rangey out of green. So I had stuff like Uvenwald Oddity. A little bit more dynamic effects is the point, or fecundity, so that whenever you lost a creature, you could draw a card. It was symmetrical in the terms of if a creature died, that player drew a card or the opponent drew a card, but it added depth to it.
I'm going to bring us down to the third layer here of...
Go ahead.
And I promise it's related, but the third layer of this conversation of when it comes to assessing what the best deck is and how you're going to address it is is your environment a pile of good stuff that it's not that they have a bunch of defined archetypes, but rather it's a collection of like Magic's greatest hits, just as an example, right? Or you're trying to just make a pile of just good stuff cards, and then people are trying to build those strategies of what they can find. It is a pile of kind of good stuff that you have to work your way around to make a strategy for. Or are you working with very strongly defined archetypes that are more synergistic? Are we going to talk about if the Bets deck is a synergistic deck, or is it a good stuff pile? And whether or not that fits with the goal of your environment.
I would agree with that 100%. Like for me, you and I labeled us in our last episode. I kind of gave us all monikers or whatever. You and I are the thematic build. We're the storytellers of our group. You agree with that? Like you and I like to tell stories. The cards tell the stories. I mean, even flavor text matters to me as much as it matters to you. And then Stu defined himself as the meta guy. And then I would say that Chris is more of the structured, understands the interactions on the hierarchy of the cube, right? The definitions, the standard bearers, the pillars, and that's kind of everybody's strengths and weaknesses. I would say that it's important for a curator to balance that the best they can, right? Because it's very challenging because you want to ebb and flow. You want to get feedback from your players, but you also want to tell a story with your environment. You don't want 5-colored good stuff because I think 5-color good stuff, Stu and I mentioned in a previous episode where we kind of talked about triomes and the potential with the triomes, with the potential of them creating a good stuff pile and a powered vintage cube. And I had a listener write into me and explain that the opportunity for that to happen was, and it just did it so eloquently, explained to me that fear was unfounded in me. And since I've actually added 5 of the triomes, originally, I guess the ones from Ikoria, I added those. I haven't seen that deck develop, but I much more prefer a story thematic build opposed to a build of just power maxing, I guess, just splashing.
Sure.
Does that make sense, May? That's kind of what I'm looking for.
Because we're looking for that synergy. We're looking for cards that go together to create that draft experience. We are looking for people to be on the rails just enough that they can kind of get a clue of what's going on here, but also enough leeway that it can give them aha moments. Versus good stuff cubes. These aren't bad cubes. They're great. They can be a lot of fun. But the draft experience for those are different. And when you are dealing with your environment, and when a deck is performing slightly better or more, or just completely dominating the draft selection is the best way that I could put it. And when that is misaligned from what your goal is, so say in the Fey Cube, if somebody were to draft a good stuff deck, I wouldn't be super upset by it, but I would be more surprised when there are so many other synergistic ways that people can creatively build their decks. I gave them the tools to find their synergy and cards that overlap in lots of different ways so that we can kind of find your own niche of a deck while having a deck that feels like your own, while also me giving you like a little bit of that bowling alley bumper just to kind of nudge you back in.
Yeah, so opposing idea to what you were saying as you're talking about. So we'll take my 540 vintage, even though I have very defined archetypes in it, right? A lot of times they fall subject. It's easy to make 5-color good stuff work, right? And it's almost encouraged with some of the good cards like the new Omnath that's multicolored, etc., that you're encouraging your players to tap into multicolor aspects. But that's still at a high-powered environment, and you can still maintain those lanes and rails. Like if you want to draft a control deck, you've got this. And if you want to go aggro, you've got this. Well, when you do an experiment like the Dumpster Fire Project, where it's not the worst, we're not doing intentionally the worst cards of Magic. We're doing cards that players gave to me and said, hey, I'd like to see how this works. It makes for a whole different type of environment. So where May posed the original question, and when we started out was, hey, Anthony, how do you control the ceilings? And whenever you replace a card within your cube environment, what do you do to stop it from being the most powerful deck? That's the core question here, right? but it really throws a real wrench in the mix, right? Whenever I say, well, what if I build a cube that's not really intentionally bad, but it's representing the worst cards in Magic? It's not. So if I take that ceiling and floor and dump it upside down, right? So when I'm talking about, like what you said before, Shiv and Wumpus, as a reminder for anybody that doesn't know what Shiv and Wumpus is, look this up. It's fantastic. For 3 colors and 1 red, you get a creature beast, trample, 6/6. Not bad, right? 4 for. But wait, there's more. When Shiv and Wumpus comes into play, any player may sacrifice a land. If a player does, put Shiv and Wumpus on the top of its owner's library. Ugh. So I'm like, all right, well, this isn't going to work. Like, so I actually sent a text to my buddies, and I'm like, we're working from the bottom up instead of trying to bring the top down, right? So I said, well, what about Countryside Crusher? And they're like, hell yeah, let's do that. Countryside Crusher for 1 colorless and red, you get a creature, Giant Warrior, 3/3. Not bad. Still not a 6/6 like the Wumpus, but wait, there's more. At the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. If a land card is put in there, repeat into your graveyard, repeat this process. Whenever a land card is put into your graveyard from anywhere, put a 1/1 counter on Countryside Crusher. And I was like, well, that's more interesting. That's more dynamic. And I don't have to worry about OP, totally putting my card back on top, controlling my draw selection. Yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. So that's a perfect example. Another one that was just the bottom up type of philosophy, right? Like, how do we take a bad card? And this is me. Like, I wanted to do this for the lulz. I'm going to give you a bad card. So we're going bottom up. We're not replacing first place with second place. We're replacing 147th place with 146th place. Meandering Tower Shell for 3 colorless and 2 green. You get a creature turtle. 5/9. That's not too bad, right? Island Walk. What? It can just hit you? Yes. But whenever Meandering Tower Shell attacks, exile it. Wait a minute, what? Return it to the battlefield under your control, tapped and attacking at the beginning of the declare attacker step on your next turn. Well, it's a 5/9 defender is the way I looked at it. And like, but when you attack, wait, there's more. So we replace that with, here's something interesting. Evolutionary Leap. For 1 colorless and 1 green, you get an enchantment. Pay 1 green, sacrifice a creature, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any random order. The point of this is the cube was flat. It was living up to the name of Dumpster Fire a little bit more than I wanted it to as a curator. Even though I have this whole amalgamation, this whole grouping of new curators, at some point I had to say, all right, this is not working. And it was said to me, like, we are not enjoying this because we're running stuff like Shiv and Wumpus.
And you know what we say here on UberCube. Follow the fun.
Follow the fun. So, yes, Shiv and Wumpus on its heels. If you look at this art, please look it up as you're listening to this. Looks fun. It's not fun. Like, nobody wants to put this card on top of their library and keep drawing it over and over again. Because I would do that out of spite. Just keep sacking my land.
So it is really funny about how we as curators can introduce cards, because we see it and we think this card seems like it could do something interesting for the play experience. But we also have to humble ourselves and realize that we can bring a horse to water, but we can't make it drink. Players aren't going to intentionally draft bad cards. They're just not. We can't make them take them. If there are better cards in the pack, they're going to take the better cards in the pack. And even if they do end up with those cards, we can't make them play them. And when it comes to cutting bottom up, the problem is that sometimes when what makes those cards bad is sometimes fundamental to what your ceiling looks like rather than your floor. And
but to reference Sam Black, and I apologize for interrupting, but he wrote an article about when you put staples, and when I say staples, expectations in front of a drafter, and it's kind of in alignment with what you just said right now. It's not necessarily the best card in the pack, but it's the card that they're most comfortable with, right?
Right.
Like we'll use, and I think it was along the lines of preordained or something like that, where they know they're going to get value out of it. There's no intrinsic cost except for playing the game of Magic. So if those cards are presented within the pack, even though you're wanting to present a thematic construction, you can't be upset that a player takes preordained when you have in the same pack a Grumgully, right? Where you're wanting to tell a story element with Grumgully and give them the lulls and laughter of, well, the name's fantastic, right? but preordain's a guaranteed Xerox effect type of card where you're going to draw and scry and all the things, right? It's just, that's what actual staples will do with your environment.
Right.
Me, I do embed staples within my environment. My horror cube does have most of those. I run the Force of Wills. I run stuff like Scavenging Ooze, etc. And they're not staples, quote unquote, but they're familiar cards. So when they're going around the table, if you take a Scavenging Ooze, I can't be upset that you didn't take some random vampire that does a thing, right? So
because it's a comfortable card. And to cycle it back, I actually am bringing back the Countryside Crusher because it's staying in the fake cube. It's just not going anywhere. But when a card is bad in your environment, it usually has to do with where it scales up with everything else. But sometimes, like you said, those comfortable cards are what gets drafted, and you have to determine whether or not those cards create the environment that you're wanting to support, but also what kind of players are supporting the very thing that you're trying to introduce. So online and data-wise, I can show that Countryside Crusher is a very popular card in my environment. I can show data that people are interested in drafting Countryside Crusher. People see Countryside Crusher in a pack and they get excited. There is literally a meme on Twitter where people always just are like, Countryside Crusher 39 rounds, let's go. And I'm like, all right, sure. And my goal as a curator is not to take away the fun from those other people by saying, no, it's a bad card because my pod doesn't draft it. And it's not as high performing as some of these other decks. My answer is, how do I make this better so it can compete with everything else? So that's why I introduced a bunch of other cards for Land Dump Red.
I'm going to do a thought quiz for you. I'm looking at a particular line on my Cube Cobra, and it's going to be a mixture of quote-unquote Cube staples, Powered Vintage, and MTGO stuff, and then embedded within are going to be some thematic stuff. And then I'm going to put them side by side. I'm going to read each one to you, and I want you to choose, lane A or B. Give me the card that you prefer. And try to be non-biased. I want you to go with...
Oh, I'm going to be biased. I'm a Johnny player.
I want you to be powerful here. I want you to embrace that warrior. Here we go. So the first one, this is a gimme. Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Good card. For 1 colorless and 1 plains, you get legendary creature, human soldier. First strike, non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. 2/1. I'm going to put it side by side in the same mana cost or mana value bracket, and I'm going to do Thalia's Lieutenant. He happens to report to her. Thalia's Lieutenant, for 1 colorless and 1 plains, you get a creature, human soldier. When Thalia's Lieutenant enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on each other human you control. Whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on Thalia's Lieutenant for a 1/1. So between Thalia and Thalia's Lieutenant, which one do you choose?
Oh, I'm choosing Thalia.
Okay, all right, next one. Moving on to the 3 mana value. Same bracket, because I do this in my cube. I can't help it. So the first one's going to be Adeline Resplendent Cathar. For 1 colorless and 2 plains, you get a legendary... Yeah, the fact you're saying good card out the gate doesn't help, right? Because it means the bias is already there. It's intrinsic. Legendary creature, Human Knight, star 4. Vigilance, Adeline Resplendent Cathar's power is equal to the number of creatures you control. Whenever you attack, for each opponent, create a 1/1 human creature token that's tapped and attacking that player or planeswalker they control. Okay, everybody knows what that does. Now we're going to go over to Bygone Bishop. So this is my spirit faction. Bygone Bishop also for 2 colors, and we're going to see which one you choose, because I'm curious. They're in the same pack, by the way. These are the same pack, side by side. That's the exercise we're doing. For 2 colorless and 1 plains, you get a creature, spirit, cleric. 2/3, flying. Whenever you cast a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less, investigate. Which one do you choose, May? Adeline or Bygone Bishop?
Well, I'm assuming if I'm seeing both, it might be a multiplayer format, because Adeline, it's not a multiplayer format?
No, she grinds. Oh, Adeline crushes 1v1.
Great card. Great card. Definitely not sliding her. But if I'm taking it in the context of it's a 1v1, I'm going to go Bygone Bishop.
Okay, sure. Adeline crushes, Powered Vintage Cube level. Yeah. No joke.
Great card.
I also run it into it. But to fortify your stance, I run it into it. A giant cube does just as well. If not better, actually. The next one, here's the next problem. We're falling into it. I'm going to call the names out, actually, at this point. Silverblade Paladin, basically Soul Bonds, gives a creature double strike. Or Skyclave Apparition. Are you familiar with this card?
Don't remember Skyclave.
I'll read it to you. For 1 card, you know what Silverblade does, right? Gives a creature double strike with the Soul Bonds. All right. Skyclave Apparition. powered vintage, by the way. 1 colorless and 2 planes, creature, core, spirit. Whenever Skyclave apparition enters the battlefield, except a 1 target non-land, non-token permanent you don't control with converted mana cost 4 or less. When Skyclave apparition leaves the battlefield, the exiled card's owner creates an XX blue illusion creature token where X is the mana value, cost, or converted, whatever, of the exiled card, and it's a 2/2. So it's O-ring-ish, but on a critter, and it gets 4 or less. Versus, I give a creature double strike.
I'm just going to take the double strike. It was a lot of text for Fiend Hunter, but kind of worse.
No, it's 100% better, I assure you. But I'll show you that. Well,
yeah, I guess I'll just have to see the card physically.
Skyclave, well, it kills Oko, kills Baby Teferi, all the things, right? Free Teferi. But that's kind of what happens when you put these side-by-side elements in here, right? I'll give you another one here. It's going to be Thalia Heretic Thar, which is, the first strike, 3/2. Creatures and non-basic lands your opponent's control into the battlefield tapped. Then I put it next to Welcoming Vampire. That's a 2/3 flyer, and it's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
But staples do oftentimes overshadow your lower tier cards.
Sure.
But
I will add
no way
context matters, and what your drafters are doing matters. The reason that I specified that I'm a Johnny player, the reason that I'm going to pick Thalia over Thalia's Lieutenant isn't because I think Thalia's Lieutenant is an uninteresting card, but when I'm looking at it, I'm more inclined to think, okay, I can draft around white creatures and make this kind of hate bear deck, and I can kind of go through my lanes of what can I do to make Thalia scary. It's easy because those lanes are familiar versus how many humans I'm going to see in the deck is probably going to be pretty big, but how often is my floor going to be relevant enough for Thalia's Lieutenant to be interesting and diverse enough versus Thalia, which always does its thing?
Correct. So it's a staple in so many words, right?
Yep.
It has that familiarity, you know what it does, really not complex, borderline evergreen type style of printing.
Yep.
Very straightforward, presents itself in a nature that didn't confuse you as a drafter. Yes, I know what this does. I'm okay with that. Whereas I read you Skyclave Apparition, you're like, that's a lot of text. I'm not familiar with that. So yeah, it's kind of what happens whenever you're drafting as well. But from a curator standpoint, it's interesting. Your original question you presented to me was, well, Anthony, whenever you remove the top tier of the best performing deck, and I told you the best performing at the time, using my horror cube may have been like my reanimator package. And then I kind of cut it down to pieces a little bit and slowed it down, and then Spells Matters replaced it. And then I have to tone that back, and then suddenly the factional vampires start. It's a never-ending cycle of whenever you cut first place down, second place steps up, but then second place becomes first place, and then now you've got it's always a hierarchical competition that's happening. It's impossible, but it's really interesting when you look at that when you're trying to go from the bottom up, like in the Dumpster Fire Cube, where I started out ground floor, right? We're down in the basement printing room. We want to get to the executive level, but we started out way down here, where all we are is mythics and rares. But we were kind of the has-beens of Magic. We don't have our place, and we're under $2. How do you stop that type of environment from getting a high-powered, overperforming archetype said within? Well, the secret is with that particular environment, we had no idea what the archetypes were. We just this card's under $2, does a thing. We tried to curate it, play testing, reps. It started to reveal itself. And now we found out that my drafters, sadly enough, are not pleased with the outcome. So we're going to start doing compensations and cuts. But we're actually, it's different than methodology that you were speaking to before. We're taking your best performing, actually trying to cut my worst performing because I want my drafters to draft.
And it's back to that, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And when they're having a bad experience because they're looking at a pack and it's just like, I don't want any of these, it's not a good time.
Correct. So how do you pull them back in, right? So in my case, I'm like, well, I don't want this to be an unsuccessful cube iteration, right? I want this project, the Dumpster Fire project, to be fun. I want to salvage this, guys. Well, I'm going to introduce some cards, but also in the spirit of that design, here's my ideas. Actually use the maybe board, what you and I talked about. And I wasn't like, I'm not going to do cuts. Here's my maybe cards. could you all please look at this? And then I said, does everybody agree with my changes and what I want to introduce?
Mhm.
Thumbs up on the text chain. All right, I'm going to do cuts. Here's my iteration. Do you believe that this meets the spirit of what each one of you is curators out of the 10 curators in this project? Does this do what you wanted it to do? Thumbs up. All right, so now we just have to play test it.
Yep.
And that's all you can do, right?
Yep.
We don't know our ceilings and floors because we're on the ground floor basement where the guy from Office Space with the red stapler.
You're the wood elemental of the group. I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit of context in case you don't know what wood elemental is.
Yeah, do it.
Wood elemental is 3 and a green for a creature elemental. As it enters the battlefield, sacrifice any number of untapped forests, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of forests sacrificed as it enters the battlefield.
That sounds amazing. Tap the Exile Pass?
It is notoriously bad.
Yeah, that's pretty great. That's pretty great. It's not quite a dust elemental, but it's right there. So this has been a fun kind of meta conversation, and I've enjoyed talking about that. I guess the gist that we got from this conversation is it's the more you chop from the top, the more that's always going to step up and replace it. You can try to balance your archetypes within your cube environments, but from myself and May, who are experienced cube curators, it's a never-ending cycle. But you're always going to be cutting the best and replacing it. And then vice versa, the bottom is always moving up as well, too. And sometimes you have to hack from the bottom. So it's trimming the fat.
So,
go ahead, Matey.
Are you ready for step 4? That's right, surprise.
There's a step 4.
There's a step 4. Whether or not your best deck is a problem or not, is it determined based off of your design goal of your metagame being a rock, paper, scissors type game, or drafting around what the best deck is?
I'm a rock, paper, scissors. I'm a believer. And when we say rock, paper, scissors, so the definition of that is per Anthony, aka Uberbear. And I believe Stu backs this one too, is the aggro is going to represent the one portion, and then mid-range, and then control. And that's kind of your ABC equation where they all counterbalance each other, where aggro beats control, but mid-range could be aggro, and then control beats...
Or I'll say for the fake cube in my specific environment, as it has a rock, paper, scissors metagame. Because Golgari midrange is a really good deck. It performs well. Whenever it's drafted, people are really happy with it. It does a really good job. It is hard to trade 1-for-1 with it. But mill decks also are really good, but you can't 1-for-1 trade with a mill deck because they don't care. They're going to be swinging over your resources.
Because they're horrible decks and they're evil. And I got beat by it. Your fake cube at CubeCon number 1, and thank you. It was awful. Oh, it's so good.
But my point is that in my environment, mill beats that Golgari midrange. And Golgari midrange is never going to be a problem because mill kind of self-regulates that in a way. But the things that beat mill is our miscellaneous aggro decks, right? Our miscellaneous, like, mono white weenie type deck, right? Things that are just going to be like, okay, I don't care that you're milling me, I'm just going to hit your face until you die.
They want pressure, and their value didn't cost them much resources, and it's on the board. So milling, I'll outrun you before you outmill me.
Exactly.
Words, right?
Versus the Golgari midrange deck, they're trying to win the game of attrition. Midrange is king in the environment, but mill does not care if you're trying to win the game via attrition. It's going to outwin you by time. Versus your faster, aggressive decks are just going to run over the mill deck. That is an example of a healthy rock, paper, scissors environment that I really like. But
yeah, I believe in it as a good fundamental for curation, by the way. I mean, I know there's certain situations where that doesn't work, but rock, paper, scissors as a generic construct does work when you're trying to build your first cube.
Right.
And then you can kind of expound upon that. But apologies, go ahead.
In a perfect world, you could draft the Changeling deck that I mentioned earlier, and you could probably run away with the whole thing. But the meta self-regulates because of it, because everybody's trying to draft that deck, or drafting the thing to beat that deck. And you as a curator have to ask if you're wanting to be one of those two lanes. Are you looking to have that rock, paper, scissors element between what your archetypes are doing, or are you looking to have whatever the best thing is, whatever beats those best things, and some variation between those two? In my opinion, when you are trying to determine what to do with the best deck of your environment and whether or not it's a problem, you have to ask yourself, well, is this a problem that's going to regulate itself because everybody's going to try to draft it? Cube is kind of a self-regulating format because everybody knows it's the best deck, everybody's going to try to draft it, therefore it's no longer available. Are you going to try to introduce the rock, paper, scissors elements by bumping up whatever other archetypes that you're trying to do to interact with that?
So I don't think there's a perfect solution.
No.
This is kind of, as we like to quote,
it is
this
completely
is the
open-ending.
mysteries of Cube. It's always open-ending because back to the fundamentals we say, the more you cut, the more replaces it, right? It's that hierarchical power structure where something's always, the cream will always rise to the top. There's no way out of it.
Right. And I think that we are in agreement that when it comes to addressing the best deck of your environment, unless it is problematic, which has to be onto context and you as a curator and how it affects your pod, then it's usually better to address the rest of your environment rather than just cutting down whatever the best deck is. Because people, whether or not they want to draft that best deck, and whether or not you can encourage other decks to perform just as well, is going to be the context that you have to provide as a curator. And we can both agree that sometimes just chopping off the top is just bringing the two heads of the Hydra.
Well, so as an example, real world example, I think I mentioned this before with my horror cube. I went to SCG Con. It was SCG Con Charlotte, and I had the fortune of playing with some of the Star City peeps. And they were, one of their criticisms for the environment, and it was very straightforward, was at the time I was running Entomb plus Reanimate, so it was a 1-2 punch. And people would grab Grave Titan at the time because that was my peak. And it was unbeatable because now you're representing 10 power on the board. So it was problematic, and it was by turn 2, and it was unbeatable. So how did I fix that? I got rid of Reanimate. I kept Entomb because people like that dynamic effect. But then I replaced it with something like Dance of the Dead so that you have slower reanimation spells versus actually having that 1-2 punch. It's more of a 1-2-3, and you have to set it up a little bit more. It gives the anti-reanimation a chance to respond and or the aggro to pressure it enough. I had to slow it down because it was too fast. It represented too much power on the board too quickly. So I didn't restructure the whole environment. I just took a spell down basically by 1 mana value to tone it back, if that makes sense.
Yep, it does, because I had to do the same thing for the Fake Cube. There was a period where Mill was the best deck because of 2 cards, 1-2 punch, where we had Fractured Sanity, which where it's just blue, blue, blue. Each opponent mills 14 cards, or you can cycle it. Each opponent mills 4. That card itself.
That was in your cart for Star City Games. You should have deleted that. That card's awful.
Anyways, that card itself was fairly fine until it was brought back from the grave. The 1-2 punch was Archaeomancer. Once you had Archaeomancer and Fractured Sanity, you just no other game actions matter because Fractured Sanity, Archaeomancer, Fractured Sanity again, you lose.
So if I had to give somebody some recommendations, if I had to give recommendations as to what to do in this scenario, is to look for, obviously we've talked about mana, I've talked about this ad nauseum, is feedback from your play group, etc., play reps. But at the same time, sometimes curving down or taking your mana value up a notch, like we've talked about this in many instances where maybe a 2-drop removal spell is too powerful, but a 3 like murder is just right, and it allows your 5 drops to thrive. Sometimes it's kind of a simple, like back to the paper, rock, scissors, also a simple math formula where maybe you don't want things to be too fast, but you don't want them to be too slow. It's kind of that Goldilocks type of concept, right?
Not too hot, not too cold, just right.
Not too hot, just right. And it does take iterations.
That could be a good title.
But you have to, practice makes perfect on that. So, like, an example would be, like, in my Monopoly Cube, I do run, like, a 1-2 drop removal spell. And it is a premium removal spell. After that, you're purely dealing with the murders and whatnot, everything 3 and above. So it kind of sets the tempo or the pace of the removal suite, right? Same holds true with, like I talked about before, with my Horror Cube. I don't want my threats to come out too rapidly, but I still want them to feel powerful. So it's a hell of a balancing act in so many words. Floors and ceilings, as we talked about on many occasions. May, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I'm just going to reiterate that the thing that happened with Fracture Sanity and Archaeomancer in my cube, and the thing that happened with Entomb and Reanimate in your cube, But how we addressed that was simply, we didn't cut what that's supposed to do, we reworked what it did so it functions better with the rest of the environment. And I think that sometimes,
100%, yeah.
Sometimes that's just what you have to do in order to answer what your best deck is, if it's a problem.
Tone it back a little bit sometimes. Just a smidge. Well, May, this has been fun. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm going to go ahead and move us over to the socials if you don't have any final thoughts.
Nope, go for it.
All right. So if you love the show, we would truly appreciate a 5-star review on your favorite player. I mean, this does a lot for UberCube to get us out to we'll call them the muggles, the non-cubers, right? We want the world to learn about this amazing thing that we love so much called Cube. UberCube is an affiliate with Ultra Sleeves. You can use our code for 5% off your purchase. You can go to www.ultrasleeves.com/UberCube and use that code, and they'll get you 5% off. I absolutely love Ultra Sleeves. Going to bling out my cubes for CubeCon 2023 with it. And if you want to support the show, please use our Ink Gaming affiliate link where you can get your playmats, your dice bags, mouse pads, etc. You can find us on Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod. Where can they find you, May, on Twitter?
You can find me at Magic1 on Twitter.
There you go. You can also reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. You can link us on Discord, #UberCube. And we have a Patreon. May, tell them about the Patreon.
Won't you tell us about the Patreon? I don't know what is going on. It is the Patreon. That's all I got. All right, sorry.
That's what you got. Bad beatboxing, a little singing. The other thing you may have noticed on our UberCube page on Buzzsprout is you will see a button you can push. If you wish to support the show, there are tiers on there that are supported by the channel. We really appreciate it. It would help us out. And we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is...
Happy meta deck. Nope, hang on. Happy cubing.
There we go. Cubing.